Hello and welcome to the Climate Change Urban Food Initiative. Welcome to our special webinar. It's our very final webinar in English of this initiative. My name is Alison Watson and I work in the Sustainable Food Systems team at UNEP. This initiative is a partnership between three partners, UNEP, IIUFN, the International Urban Food Network, and the Fondation Nicolas Hulot. And we're very pleased that you could join us. Now today we have a special guest. His name is David SATTERTHWAITE, and he was the coordinating lead author of the chapter on urban adaptation in the fifth assessment of the IPCC. And what we'd like to share with you today is his views on the strategic linkages between climate change and urban food. So I'm going to get right into it and I'm going to share the screen now with David. And he's going to talk to us fairly quickly as soon as he's able to see the button that can share his screen and share his thoughts. David, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Shall I go?
Yes, go for it. Thank you.
Okay. I want to look at urban adaptation to climate change and the many linkages it has to food systems and to food security. We know that climate change will bring many very serious impacts on cities. It includes impacts on food systems, on food production, and on the capacity of low-income households to afford food. We know that it will impact most on those living in informal settlements. Around a seventh of the world's population lives in settlements such as that illustrated on the screen at the moment. Here is another picture from an informal settlement in Cebu in the Philippines. You can imagine how much at risk they are from storms or floods or sea level rise. We know that climate change impacts are increasing and will continue to increase until greenhouse gas emissions stabilize and fall. We know that there's a very urgent need to cut greenhouse gas emissions to avoid dangerous climate change. But we don't know the precise levels of climate change that will trigger abrupt change or irreversible change. We don't know exactly how climate change will impact on each city or on the areas from which cities draw their food and their water supplies, which makes precise responses much more difficult. But we do know that the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Paris, that's meeting in December, has to reach a global agreement on emissions reduction. And we hope that this agreement will be sufficient to avoid dangerous climate change. So let's consider the many ways in which human-induced climate change impacts on cities. It means higher and increasing maximum temperatures, more hot days and heat waves over nearly all the world's land areas. This will bring rise in mortality and illness from heat stress in many urban locations. You already have cities that experience temperatures of 40 to 45 degrees. Imagine how much that will impact on the population as those maximum temperatures increase. Of course, problems are more serious for those trapped in heat islands within cities. And it's particular groups such as infants and young children, the elderly, expectant mothers, and those with certain chronic diseases that will be most impacted. So too will those who work outdoors. Climate change will bring more intense rainfall in almost all locations. This will bring increased flooding and landslides, causing obviously injury, loss of life, loss of property, damage to infrastructure, and damage to agriculture. Flood runoff often contaminates water supplies and causes outbreaks of waterborne diseases. Climate change will bring storms with higher wind speeds. Obviously, this means structural damage to buildings, power lines, communication masts, and other infrastructure, and of course, agricultural produce. Tropical cyclones will have higher peak wind intensities and peak precipitation intensities, and these will bring many very large disasters. In many locations, availability and increased risk of drought. Many cities are already experiencing extreme water shortages, and How do you manage a city of several million inhabitants that loses its main water supplies? There'll be increased variability in the monsoon rains and increased flood and drought magnitude in much of Asia. Sea level rise everywhere will bring increased coastal erosion, land loss, and more floods from storm surges. Hundreds of millions of urban dwellers live in low elevation coastal zones at risk. Higher average temperatures in cities will see disease vector range spreading and worsening air quality. It's worth reflecting a little on different contexts. This picture is a picture of my home, or rather one flat within 4 stories. And just think how resilient I am to climate change. I have water piped to my home 24 hours a day. I have sewers, I have storm drains. I have a healthcare system that will deliver for me, that I can walk in at no cost within 200 yards. I have insurance for my home. I have insurance for my possessions. So even in the normal run, without making any plans for climate change adaptation, I'm pretty resilient. I've also got the police to call on if needed. Imagine the difference here in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, where the people living on these stilts don't have piped water, don't have sewers, don't have drains, don't have health care, are very much at risk from floods, as you can imagine, from the height of the stilts on which they are. They don't have insurance for their homes, they don't have insurance for their possessions. It's the 1/7 of the world's population living in settlements like these that are most at risk from climate change. We did an assessment of how urban centres worldwide are doing in relation to building adaptive capacity. Around a billion urban dwellers have almost no adaptive capacity and live in cities with almost no investment capacity. Another 1.5 billion have some capacity to act on climate change, but this needs to be enhanced. About 1 billion have adaptive capacity, but it has to be acted on. Even wealthy cities may have the resources to invest, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're doing so. Then you look at the tiny proportion that are addressing transformational adaptation. That's adaptation that addresses the scale of the risk within a commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What does all this imply for food systems? Well, obviously, greater disruption to food production from disasters. Here the impact is not only on the injury and loss of life, but also on damage to roads, including roads to market, damage to crops, damage to agricultural land. There will be constraints on food production from a decreased water supply that's going to bring decreased crop yields in many places. There are all the difficulties facing farmers with changes in the timing of rains and often their intensity, which disrupts the planning cycle for planting and harvesting. There are also all the disruptions to food consumption for urban dwellers from the disruption to their livelihoods. Much of the hunger in cities is not from a shortage of food, but from people who lack the income to afford food. Among the other many food-related impacts will be increased illness and injuries associated with climate change, disruption to water supplies, diarrheal diseases, extended ranges where malarial mosquitoes can breed. All these will impact on nutrition. There's also all the impacts on street food producers and vendors, on which many low-income groups rely for much of their food intake. And all of this is within a context where urban and peri-urban food production struggles to get the land they need from urban development. What can cities do to be better prepared? Well, one of the keys for climate change adaptation is effective, accountable city governments that respond to the needs and the priorities of their citizens, that take measures in response to these needs and priorities, which obviously includes increased local food production and ensuring adequate consumption for all. There's much else besides that local governments can do to increase investments to reduce disaster risks so the risk is removed. universal provision of services, including safe, affordable water, good quality sanitation, provision for removal of solid wastes, decent drains, and safety nets, including cash transfers. A good healthcare system prevents or cures many of the diseases that impact most on nutrition. And of course, good land use planning and management in and around the city periphery has the potential to include support for urban and peri-urban agriculture and to enhance this within city plans. A city that does development and disaster risk reduction well builds the institutions and capacities to do climate change adaptation well, and also the capacity to address hunger and any problems with nutrition and food within their jurisdiction.
Thanks, David. Can you hear me now?
Absolutely, yep.
And is that that's your conclusion right there? Just to make it, yes, excellent. Well, thank you so much. Your task was to give us an overview of the issue of climate change, urban development and urban food systems and the linkages there, and you did that very well. And I think some of the pictures that you've shown us are just excellent at giving us a stark reminder of some of the differences in our across the globe and how people live and how people carry on with their livelihoods, and the task ahead of us to address some of the issues that climate change will raise. So we really appreciate that, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I enjoyed doing it.
Thank you very much, David.